kid's mum and her sister got lost, and they took a wrong turn and ended up at Gunnamatta Beach. They'd asked a couple of questions at the gate, you know, is this patrolled beach, is it safe for children? And on both they were told yes. They didn't realise there was a beach further down. I knew this area. I knew this beach, I knew to stay away from it. I knew how dangerous this beach was. So my kids were Emma, Luke, Amy, Ben, Molly, Connor and Cameron. And then there was Mary's sister Sharon, and there was Catherine, Belinda, James and Gary. From what was said to me, there was a big sandbar. They thought that was a perfect place for the boogie boards, the waves weren't too big. What they didn't realise was there was a rip operating next to it. One moment they were towing Molly on a boogie board and Ben was nearby. Next moment they were hit by a big wave and they were washed into those rips. And it didn't take long. It didn't take long for them to get out past the breakers. It was only when Luke arrived and said, "Where are they?" to James, and he said, "They're gone, they're out there." So they actually headed off to the surf club, which is about 600 metres down, further down the beach. So they come out on the ducks, the surf lifesavers. Ben was flown to the Children's Hospital. He was put on life support, and the next day I had to make that decision to turn his life support off. So Ben went on to become an organ donor. On that day, we lost 4. I lost my son Ben and my daughter Molly, and lost 2 nieces, Catherine and Belinda. They were never recovered. You know, people will say that time heals. No, time will teach you to live with it. Every time I hear of another drowning, of people being caught in a rip, I just think it's enough, it's enough. It's time now to draw the line. It's time to stop people from entering these rips. If you don't know the area, you don't know the risk, you don't know how to spot a rip, don't be there. It's as simple as that.
This is the ocean. Salty and wet. This is where our story begins. Before we can become good surfers, we want to have at least a basic understanding of what makes a wave work. We have to learn to read the water. We start in the beginning with the simple observation. What clues can we get just from looking at the water? Things that'll give you an idea of what's happening on a given day, because in surfing every day is different and every wave is different. This is an unfamiliar world, and today that's what we're going to be talking about.
What makes waves? Well, basically it's simple. It's wind. When the wind blows, you get waves in the ocean. And there's 3 things about wind that are important. 1 is how fast the wind blows, 2 is how long the wind blows for, and 3 is what is the distance over water that the wind will blow. So the biggest waves occur when the wind is blowing hard, it lasts for a few days, and it's got large distances to blow over. And there's a transfer of energy from the wind into the water itself, and the waves start moving. So how do we describe waves in the ocean? It's actually really simple. And what I'll do is I'll draw a nice little wave in the sand. Now, every wave has a top called the crest, every wave has a bottom called the trough. And the vertical distance between the crest and the trough is what we call the wave height. Now, the distance between that crest and that crest is something we call the wave length. So every wave has a height and every wave has a wave length. Now, let's assume you're standing in the water. The time it takes for that wave to reach you is what we call the wave period. So the wave period is the time between waves. And wind waves have wave periods of about 3 to 8 seconds, and swell waves have periods of about 8 to 20 seconds. Now as the wave travels, there's a difference between how the energy of the wave moves and how the water particles move themselves. The shape of the wave, the up and down motion, that's actually the energy moving through the wave. Water particles, believe it or not, are trapped in these circles, these orbital motions underneath the wave. And these orbits get smaller and smaller and smaller as you get deeper until they finally peter out. Now in deep water, waves can actually travel very fast. But once you get into shallower water, those orbits start to hit the bottom, and that physically slows the wave down, and that's what causes waves to break. In this episode, we're going to focus on breaking waves. What happens to waves when they come into shallow water? How do they slow down? How do they change their shape? How do they start to bend? And when they break, how do they break? Do they curl over and crash? Do they roll in gently? These are some of the answers that we're going to explain today. The way that waves finally break really depends on what's underneath. What's the shape of the bottom? There's three basic types. There's plunging waves, spilling waves, and surging waves. Now today behind me we've got some classic spilling waves. The bottom of the beach or the ocean is fairly flat, so the waves come in, they slow down gently, they steepen gently, and when they break gently. And the top of the waves just spill down the front of the wave. That's why we call it a spilling wave. Now, another common type is called the plunging wave, and these are called dumpers or barrels or tubes. And these happen when the waves go from deep water to shallow water really quickly, and they slow down so fast that you start to get this curl or motion of water curling over and crashing down. Now the third type is called the surging wave, and these ones are also very common, but they're totally different. They don't curl over and plunge, they don't spill, they just sort of form this bulge near the shoreline, and when they break they just rush up really fast, or they surge up really fast, and then they rush back. And they tend to happen when beaches are fairly steep. Well, the whole reason we get surfing waves is because when the waves come in from deep to shallow water, they slow down and they interact with the shape of the bottom, and sometimes they can bend, and that's called wave refraction.
Exactly how they sound, right? Offshore are winds that blow away from the shore. So that's offshore. They blow in this direction. So we can call that offshore, right? And then onshore winds are the opposite. They blow from the ocean on to the shore. So
the process depends on waves hitting the beach at an angle, as they do along much of this coast. Let's concentrate on just a few particles. The particles are washed up on the beach by the waves, which, driven by the prevailing wind, hit the beach at an angle. As the water runs back, it pulls the particles straight back into the sea, under the force of gravity. The next wave moves the particles a little bit further up the beach, and so on. The process is known as longshore drift.
Hit you with some statistics. We know that about 96% of Australians know they should swim between the red and yellow flags, but 40% sometimes don't. Now that's a problem, because we also know that at any given time in Australia there's about 17,000 rips operating on our beaches. So if you don't know how to spot a rip, which most Australians don't, that's a real problem. Another thing is that there's 11,000 beaches in Australia, which is great, except that only 4% are actually patrolled by lifesavers and lifeguards. So if you don't know how to spot a rip and you're swimming on an unpatrolled beach, there's a good chance you might get stuck in one. So what are rip currents? It's a really good question. Well, rips are all about breaking waves. If there's no waves breaking, there's no rips. But when waves do break, they break in shallow water. And the white water you see is water that's being pushed towards the beach and it piles up. Rips are one way to get that extra water piling up at the beach back offshore. And most rips flow offshore in deeper channels between the shallower sandbars. And they exist to get that extra water back offshore. There's some myths and misconceptions about rips. One is that rips will pull you under. Well, they don't. There's no such thing as an undertow, and rips definitely don't pull you under the water. The second is that rips are often called rip tides. Well, they're not a tide. A tide is a wave that goes up and down during the day. Rips are currents that flow pretty steady. The third is that rips will take you way out to sea. Well, the truth is, they don't. Basically, rips are strong, narrow currents that flow from the shoreline out towards the breaking waves. So, if the waves are breaking about 50 meters offshore, that's about how far the rip will take you. The best way to spot rips is to look for nice dark gaps going out through the surf. So right here, we've got a nice dark gap. It almost looks like a road or a path going out through the surf, and that's the rip. Over here, we've got a shallow sandbar. On the other side of the rip, there's another shallow sandbar. That makes the waves break. All that white water piles up on the beach, starts flowing along the beach, and then it turns offshore and goes out in the rip. And that's how you spot a rip. A view from a headland is always a good way to spot a rip because you're looking down on the beach and they're always easier to see from above.
But down here on the water's edge, rip currents can be a lot harder to find, and you need to spend a bit more time looking for them. If you're swimming at a patrolled location, there are always safety signs pointing out the dangerous currents, and you should avoid the water around those signs.
What we do is we put in some harmless purple dye to show where the water goes. The great thing about the dye is that wherever the rip is going, that's where the dye will go as well. Sometimes rips go in circles and can often go back onto the shallow sandbars, but all rips also have a habit of pulsing. And what that means is suddenly the rip will take off and literally squirt out the back for only a short period of time, maybe 30 seconds or less. You can see the chopped up, messy white water that's just gone out, and then it's just stopped. And that's one common thing about these flash rips is that they can suddenly occur anywhere where there's suddenly been a large group of waves breaking, and it pushes the rip out, and then it disappears.
Finally, we get something called a permanent rip, or a headland rip. And these are rips that are pushed against the headland, and they're there almost all the time. So it's another good reason to always be careful when you're swimming close to headlands and rocks.
As we've seen, rips can change from day to day and even time to time. Problem is that they can look like they're the safest place to swim on the beach because they are the calm water. Fortunately, it's the white water where the waves are breaking that are actually the safest place to swim. So that brings us to our first rip safety tip.
To avoid rip currents, always swim between the red and yellow flags. It can be a pretty scary experience being caught in a rip current, but you can survive them by knowing your options. The main thing is to stay calm and float. Rips are only a flow of water. They're not going to pull you down or underwater, and they're not going to take you all the way out to sea. If you need help, raise an arm and attract attention so the lifesavers and lifeguards can see you and they'll come out and help you.
What we do know about rip currents is that sometimes they flow in circles and can bring you back onto the sandbank. What they don't do is they don't flow into the middle of the ocean. So while you're waiting for help, there's a good chance that you might end up being brought back onto the safety of the sandbar.
Lifeguards and lifesavers are really good at spotting people who might get themselves into trouble before they do. We always try to move these people into a safer area and tell them what's wrong. Another option is to escape the rip by swimming parallel to the beach. This is usually towards the breaking waves and the white water of the sandbank. Once you're in this area, you can usually stand up or the waves will help push you back towards the shoreline. Remember, if you ever feel tired in the water, float to conserve your energy. The most important thing is to keep your head above the water and stay calm. One thing you should never do is swim against a rip current. These things can flow pretty fast, and if you swim against it, you're just going to tire yourself out and possibly swim backwards. Rip currents on their own don't make people drown. In fact, every day, surfers, swimmers, lifesavers and lifeguards use rip currents as the best way to get from the shoreline through the surf to the open water. So you can survive rip currents by knowing your options. If you need help, stay calm, float and attract attention. Another option is to escape the rip current by swimming parallel to the beach. Most importantly, if you ever feel tired, conserve your energy and always remember that the waves can assist you back to the shoreline.
So before you go to the beach this summer, learn how to spot a rip. And when you do go to the beach, get in the habit of looking for them before you go swimming.
The things to look for: deeper, dark-coloured water, fewer breaking waves, a rippled surface surrounded by smooth waters, anything floating out to sea, or foamy, discoloured sandy water flowing out beyond the waves. Rips don't always show all of these signs at once. Some rips may only have one or two signs. Always spend time checking the water before you go in.
Everyone who falls into cold water has the same instinct, to swim hard. But cold water shock can make them gasp uncontrollably and breathe in water. Then they drown. But if they just float until the cold water shock has passed, then they'll...
Once you have waded to a depth at which point you can start swimming, do a dolphin dive, roll onto your back and put your fins on one at a time. The important thing to remember when putting your fins on is to take it step by step. Don't get tangled up. Concentrate on getting one fin on properly, then move on to the other fin and you're away.